So the New York Times just came out with an article comparing the protest movements over the slaughter happening in Gaza with the protest movements that happened in the 1960s and 70s over the Vietnam War, and that finally succeeded in ending the Vietnam War. And this New York Times article, here it is quite fascinating in the way that it is actually more or less balanced. This is for once a piece where the New York Times tries to portray both sides of an argument, interviews people and gives their viewpoint and represents those as viewpoints and not as dogma or as absolute truth, and then lets the reader kind of make his and her mind up themselves, which to me signifies that something is going seriously wrong with the way that the slaughterhouse in Gaza is developing. The fronts seem not to be as clear cut, and the opinion in Washington is definitely now moving against the Biden administration, to the point that even the New York Times is trying to publish something more or less balanced. Let's go through it here. In campus protest over Gaza, echo of outcry over Vietnam. That's the entire premise, is in how far is this movement similar to the 60s and 70s, which actually was a real problem to the power installed in Washington at the time, right? It was a real problem. And it actually ended with the resignation of Nixon. So it starts a bit with quoting somebody from the Palestinian side. For so long, we couldn't get Palestine to be that issue for people to care about, but now people care about it because they're seeing it, they're watching it on their social media, they're watching it on the news. And the article then continues, to many who have studied or lived through the Vietnam era, the parallels to Gaza protests are compelling. A powerful military reigning, aerial destruction on a small underdeveloped, non-white land, a generation divide over the morality of the conflict, a sense that the war represented far broader political and cultural currents, an unswavering confidence, critics might say sanctimony, among students that their cause is righteous. This is quite a way of portraying what is currently going on, which I do think is actually how a lot of people on campuses and outside view this slaughter that's happening. Then the article, of course, has to bring in what's different, which is fair enough. Okay, the difference can be glaring too, beginning with a terrorist attack by Hamas that set this war in motion. Here you can see again the usual talking point of like boiling everything down to the one moment of violence against Israel on 7th of October, which again, like the argument here is then of course that before 7th of October everything was peaceful and everything was fine, and there was never ever done any kind of injustice, but injustice started on 7th of October, and now everything that's coming at the moment from Israel to Gaza is actually just restoring the order, right? So this arbitrational point of start, which is a very common way of defending all and any kind of warfare and injustice by picking your own starting point. But okay, fine. For which there's nothing comparable in Vietnam. Well, in a sense, in Vietnam, the entire narrative was built on the United States having helped South Vietnam before, and then having come under attack itself in the Gulf of Tonkin, which we then which we found out later on was pure fabrication. So the fabrication in Gaza, of course, we know that the October 7th attack are not fabrication. These are real attacks that were committed. What we don't know is how many people actually died from IDF fire and how many were directly killed by Hamas. This is like the huge discussion at the moment, and it's true that these are two very different causes for then mass slaughter on the other side and bringing in massive forces. But it is still, to me, unclear how much of the final verdict of history will be of how justified Israel's strike is. And that's not just to say of proportionality, but of actually then going and striking back instead of doing what the other thing that would have been possible, which is striking back, fighting back the people who attacked the kibbutzim and attacked Israel, and then stopping there. That would have been an option, but obviously that was not the route taken. The Gaza war is not being fought by the American military. We are still in what is different to Vietnam. Unlike Vietnam, where more than 58,000 Americans died and young men faced a military draft. True, but it shows very clearly how a large proportion of people on the ground understand what currently is going on in Israel as part of extended US foreign policy, as a responsibility of the United States. I mean, if you immediately give one side of a war $14 billion to fight it against another one and rain hellfire on a civilian population, then it is not that difficult for people on the ground in the state giving that aid to connect the dots and say, like, hey, maybe maybe we are guilty on our front of helping to kill these people over there, right? And at the moment, we've seen this. The United States has clearly moved on from fighting proxy wars itself to just using these forces on the ground even more skillfully than before. And like zero involvement of their own boots on the ground. I mean, in the Vietnam War, it was, of course, the South Vietnamese who fought the major part of the war, but the US forces were also on the ground, right? And this has stopped. Neither in Ukraine nor in Israel. There is US personnel that is like, with rifle in hand, storming toward the enemy and fighting. They let that be done by the actual proxies. The only involvement is on the most of the involvement is on the political level, on the tactical strategic level probably as well. There must be, just as in the case of Ukraine, there must be also military to military connections and advising going on. But okay, fine. So the article actually then tries to frame these parallels in an interesting way, and continues: the United States waded into Vietnam in a show of superpower hubris. So still the differences. Israel, he said, is fighting for its existence after a terrorist attack that killed 1,200 citizens. The current war, he said, has a lot more moral and philosophical nuance. So it's really interesting how like 50 years between a war you fought and the current moment can like put a completely different perspective. If you asked a pro-Vietnam War American at the time, in the 70s and 60s, and also if you read the comments about it back then, they would all agree that Vietnam is the was the Ukraine of the time, right? That's where we stand. Civilization will stand or fall with South Vietnam. We're defending democracy right here in Saigon. That was the entire narrative. And the issue now that this is being by experts who are then like uncritically quoted by the New York Times, represented as superpower hubris, also tells you something about how this war is being remembered. And here the idea that you can portray Israel now as being way more philosophically nuanced, right? I mean, the philosophical nuance of killing 20,000 civilians in Gaza with all of this US equipment. I mean, the philosophical nuance of 20,000 dead civilians within 2 months. I mean, this is quite fascinating, isn't it? And then the article discusses that there are also pro-Israeli marches, and that both movements, the pro-Palestinian and pro-Israeli movements, reflect a kind of instinctive and initial solidarity with the underdog, he added, and related is a sense of solidarity with people who are fighting to have their own country and be freed from a kind of colonial existence. And here the Times talks about both sides. So it's actually trying to understand what motivates both groups. Quite fascinating from this publication here. Then a little bit more about Vietnamese in America and how the Vietnamese community understands this. So then they are interviewing a Vietnamese American. I feel it in my body, and a lot of people in our Vietnamese community feel it in our bodies, to be resisting war, to be resisting occupation. Again, actual journalism, actual trying to understand what people think, and reporting that. To critics of the Gaza protests, the current movement reflects the excesses, not the virtues, of the Vietnam protests, with chants now that to some suggest genocide against the Jewish people. So now we're on the pro-Israeli side, right? And getting a lot of this kind of very common narrative that we've been reading a lot over the last 2 months, right? The last 2 months, the New York Times is filled with articles about how suppressed the Jews are, and how the Jews are the real victims of what's currently going on because of October 7th, and because everything that happened to them with the Holocaust and previously in history, right? This has and now the New York Times switches over to explain this view. And those critics also accuse the pro-Palestinian demonstrators of hypocrisy, saying that the many of the rallies include side issues that would be antithetical to many Palestinians, like women's issues and LGBTQ rights. So, okay, the good thing is the New York Times only reports this, which I find fair. This is okay. You can report that people say that. What you shouldn't do is to make the argument for these people and say that this is what reality is. I also find it a very disingenuous argument to say that the people who protest for Palestine are stupid because the Palestinians, the Arabs, are not pro-LGBTQ and are not pro-women's rights, because that is again this approach of some people to say, like, okay, unless somebody supports 100% of what you believe in, you cannot march with them, you cannot stand with them, you cannot stand for anyone who has even the slight little disagreement with you on another issue. And that is, of course, a tactic to splinter apart any kind of movement to realize a cause. And the most important thing at the moment is to stop the dying in Gaza, to stop the onslaught and this genocide against the Palestinians. And of course, people who make this argument, they just try to prevent this coalition from happening by basically saying, like, hey, you're stupid that you march with somebody who doesn't share all of your opinions. Very disingenuous, but okay, fine. The New York Times actually just reports that this is the argument. Then it interviews Kenneth L. Marcus, the chairman of a Jewish civil rights institution. There may be some people participating in these protests who think they're supporting Palestinians, but the movement they are advancing is predominantly an anti-Semitic movement, he said, adding that it has its genesis in a celebration of violence. This is absolute nonsense, utter nonsense. But again, it is being reported as something that a pro-Israel person said. I mean, of course, the goal is to stop the dying and to help Palestinians to actually survive this terrific, horrible onslaught. And again, that this pro-Israeli think tanker here, a civil rights institution, that this person tries to frame protest against Israel's killing as anti-Semitic, is something that we've seen a lot over the last 2 months, and it's actually not working anymore. People are not buying it. Nobody's buying it. I mean, the whole anti-Semitism charge right now is losing all its bite that it used to have for decades, and this is actually a real problem, because there's real anti-Semites that will also be empowered through this. So what the Jewish pro-Jewish and pro-Israeli side here is doing is it's seriously hurting future generations of Jews, who will then for real suffer from anti-Semitism if that comes up again. So it is absolutely, this is a very, very, very irresponsible thing to do. But fine, the article continues and compares a bit the 60s, 70s with today. Then the view that these movements don't come out of nowhere, kind of connecting the current pro-Palestinian movement with the earlier protests that erupted in response to the things that happened in Ferguson in 2014. Okay, so there are things in the United States that are seriously going wrong politically, and all of these resentments are fueling the current protests, is one of the arguments here, which is probably not wrong. And then, interestingly, Larry P. Gross, an expert on media and culture at some university, says that the Israelis and their PR arm fundamentally didn't understand the degree to which they were losing young people. He said they're a reflexive they reflexively played the Holocaust card, as we have seen just above, over and over again. He added, even as we went from seeing pictures of Russians bombing Ukraine as a war crime to pictures of Israel bombing Gaza. Support for Palestinians among the young, he said, is going to last. I think it's one of those generational shifts. This is astonishing to have this in the New York Times, right? That even this, what I just said about that stupid Holocaust argument on top there, that this anti-Semitism argument on top, that this is then being reflected and is being discussed. Okay, New York Times, you're doing your job, but you could clearly see where the actual fear lies, because the very last few paragraphs discuss what this could mean for the political leadership of the United States. People like me were opposed to Humphrey. Now, I'm talking again about some of the people who were there in the 60s, and the person Humphrey, who was running against Nixon for the Democrats, and were happy in a sense to see Humphrey lose, so the Democratic frontrunner against Nixon. He said, now a lot of people are saying they'll never go for Biden, and it's not clear who they vote for, if they vote at all. You can feel the fear of these people that the current protest movement might actually lead to the victory of Donald Trump in the next elections, right? Everything and then like a channel goes toward that final conclusion. This could be the political end of Biden, and well, if it's not Biden, then it will probably be Trump, and everybody in the establishment in the U.S., in New York and Washington, is very much afraid of this. So, what does this tell us? I am not entirely sure where things are going, but the war in Gaza against the Palestinians and the slaughter of the Palestinians is definitely a bigger problem to the U.S. establishment than many would have predicted, probably at the beginning of this. And maybe the tide will turn. Maybe the tide will turn, because at the moment, even the New York Times is forced to be a little bit both-sided on this issue. It is Christmas Day today. I hope for nothing more than peace between the peoples of Israel and of Palestine, and I hope that the political will come together to end the slaughter and finally move towards a real solution. One state, two states, 80 states, I don't know, but one that lets people live with each other and not against each other. This slaughter and this cycle of violence must end. My friends, Merry Christmas and hopefully a Happy New Year.